Russian state exports of defense products have hit the $4 billion milestone to the continent.
Africa has just shocked the world. Several African nations quietly signed $4 billion worth of military deals with Russia, and no one is more stunned than the West. For decades, Western countries were Africa's first stop for everything: money, aid, weapons, training, and protection. They controlled the narrative and the security architecture. But something has changed. As the world shifts toward a new multipolar era, led by rising powers like Russia and China, African governments are making bold moves. They're turning away from the West, slowly, deliberately, and with purpose. This $4 billion agreement with Moscow isn't an isolated event. It's another piece in a growing pattern of Africa building alliances outside Western influence. But what exactly is inside this deal? Why is it so important? And how is the West reacting behind closed doors? Let's break it all down. According to new reports, Russia's military footprint in Africa isn't just growing, it's exploding. Rosoboronexport, Russia's state-run arms exporter, has quietly built a $4 billion portfolio across the continent. Think about that. Deals worth billions, spread across almost every corner of Africa. Today, Russia is working with 46 out of Africa's 54 nations. That level of reach is almost unmatched, even by some Western powers. Alexander Mikheyev, the CEO of Rosoboronexport, revealed the scale of this partnership in an interview with Russia's Zvezda TV channel. He called the expansion impressive, pointing out how deeply Russia is now embedded in countries like Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, the Republic of the Congo, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the numbers tell a story. The cooperation isn't slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. Mikheyev says Africa is no longer just a market for Russia. It's one of the most promising regions on their radar. Across the continent, countries are looking for something the West has struggled to deliver: modern defense equipment, affordable training, and real technological support. And Russia has positioned itself perfectly to fill that gap. For many African governments, these new contracts offer something powerful: access to advanced military hardware, maintenance services, and technology transfers. Things that can transform an entire army, not just a single battlefield. But it doesn't end with weapons. Russia has expanded its presence into training programs for civilians, embedding itself deeper into African society than ever before. Step by step, one partnership at a time, Moscow is tightening its grip. And honestly, this shouldn't surprise anyone. Last year, Russia didn't just attend the Africa Aerospace and Defense event, it dominated it. They showcased everything from battle tanks and flamethrowers to rocket launchers. It was a clear message: Russia is here, and it's not leaving. What African countries plan to do with this new wave of foreign weaponry is still unclear, but analysts warn that this rapid military growth could soon spark international debate and possibly international fear. Because when $4 billion worth of weapons land in a region already filled with tension, history tells us one thing: the world will start paying attention. But why exactly should this spark international concern? Are African nations suddenly not sovereign? When the United States or any Western power buys or manufactures weapons, does the world panic? Does the media erupt? Does anyone call it a threat? Of course not. This is the paternalism African leaders have been talking about for decades, a system where the West believes it can decide what Africa should or shouldn't own, who Africa should or shouldn't partner with. Pan-African voices have repeated it again and again. African countries are sovereign states. They have every right to buy the weapons they need from whoever they choose, without asking permission from Washington, London, or Brussels. So, what's the real issue? The truth is uncomfortable for the West. The only reason this deal has become a global talking point is because the weapons are coming from Russia. What we're seeing now is a deeper fear, a realization that Western influence on the continent is fading fast. And Russia's growing military presence in a region once firmly controlled by the West is a direct reminder of that shift. But here's the twist. This isn't the first time Russia's expanding footprint in Africa has made headlines. This has been building for years, quietly, steadily, and right under the radar. Just a few months ago, another report sent shockwaves across Europe. Images revealed that Russia was quietly expanding its military footprint across Africa, not with rumors, but with hard evidence. The photos showed Russian-made Su-24 fighter bombers landing at an airbase in Bamako, Mali. Another image captured a massive cargo ship, the Petra, flying the Russian flag as it unloaded military vehicles on the coast of Guinea. This wasn't speculation. This was Russia moving hardware, and moving it fast. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The report didn't come from African governments. It came from European authorities, the very people who helped impose sanctions designed to isolate Russia after the war in Ukraine. Those sanctions were supposed to choke Russia's economy. They were supposed to cut Moscow off from global trade. They were supposed to weaken Russia's ability to fund its military operations. But they didn't. Instead, Russia found a way around the blockade by turning to Africa. African nations, desperate for effective weapons to deal with insurgencies, terrorism, and regional conflicts, opened their doors, and Russia stepped in with exactly what they needed. European officials now say Russia is not only evading sanctions, it is competing directly with the West for influence on the African continent. In other words, the battleground has shifted from Ukraine to Africa. So, what does all this really tell us? It tells us that the West is watching Africa closely, far more closely than they admit. Even leaders like Donald Trump, who once acted as if Africa meant nothing to US foreign policy, were quietly monitoring every shift on the continent. Remember when Trump entered office? There were loud rumors that he wanted to shut down US Africa Command, the very nerve center of America's military influence in Africa. He called it expensive. He called it unnecessary. He said it wasn't worth American taxpayers' money. But here's the part no one talks about. AFRICOM was never dismantled. Not then, not now. It is still fully operational across Africa today. Why? Because the West understands one thing very clearly. Losing military influence in Africa means losing strategic power on the global stage. During the colonial era, a nation's strength was measured by how many territories it controlled. Today, that colonial map has changed, but the mindset hasn't. Instead of physical colonies, powerful countries now fight for soft power, using military partnerships, troops, bases, and equipment to maintain influence. So when Western officials pretend Africa doesn't matter, don't be fooled. They want the minerals, they want the trade routes, they want the strategic bases, and above all, they want control. This is why they're suddenly so alarmed by Russia's rise in Africa. Because in country after country, Russia is quietly replacing them, not with colonization, but with cooperation the West can no longer match. And the West knows exactly what that means. But here's the real question the West should be asking. Why are African nations choosing Russia in the first place? Why are even pro-Western countries, nations like Nigeria, suddenly opening their doors to Moscow? To find the answer, we have to go back, all the way back to the beginning. Since 1960, the year many African nations gained independence, the West positioned itself as Africa's default partner for trade, security, and economic cooperation. Not because Africa chose them, but because Africa believed it had no other options. For decades, that arrangement held firm, but the relationship between Africa and the West was never one of equals. It was built on the same foundation left behind by colonialism, a system where the West still saw itself as the master and Africa as the student. The West continued to act like Africa was a project, not a partner. Africa's vast population, rich minerals, and strategic position were treated as tools, assets to be used to advance Western interests, even when it hurt the continent. And the mindset went even deeper. To many Western powers, Africa was seen as a child, a continent that didn't know what it wanted, one that needed guidance, supervision, and constant correction. That is why Western interference became so common. France influencing elections, the US shaping military decisions, foreign governments pulling strings in African politics, the economy, and national defense. For years, this was normal. For years, Africa accepted it. But today, that era is ending. Trade between Africa and the West is the perfect example of this unequal partnership. For decades, before China emerged as a global powerhouse, Europe was Africa's biggest trading partner. But that relationship carried a heavy colonial shadow, one Africa could never fully escape. In 2002, the European Union signed the Cotonou Agreement, one of the EU's most ambitious development partnerships ever created. 79 countries from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific joined the deal. On paper, it looked like a fair partnership, equal, mutually beneficial, cooperative. But in reality, the relationship remained deeply unequal. African nations were still placed in a subordinate position, and this became painfully clear during negotiations. The EU dictated the terms, African countries followed them, and whenever disagreements arose, Europe used its economic leverage to push African nations into accepting conditions that benefited Europe far more than Africa. The inequality became even more visible in the negotiations of the Economic Partnership Agreements, a key component of the Cotonou framework. These deals opened African markets to European goods, while Europe kept many of its doors closed through strict standards, hidden restrictions, and protective policies. It was modern colonialism, wrapped in diplomatic language, and Africa felt it. The Economic Partnership Agreements, the EPAS, were sold as a great opportunity for Africa. Under these deals, African countries could export their goods to Europe duty-free, but there was a catch, a big one. Africa had to open its own markets to European imports by reducing tariffs. On the surface, it looked like a fair exchange. In reality, it was anything but. When the EPA was first introduced, African leaders hesitated. They weren't confused. They weren't slow. They understood exactly what this deal meant. If they signed, giant European companies with stronger brands, better technology, and far higher production quality would flood African markets, and because their products would be cheaper than anything local industries could produce, African businesses would collapse overnight. Europe could afford to open its doors to Africa because Africa mainly exported raw materials, the oil, cocoa, minerals, and agricultural products Europe needed for its factories. But Africa couldn't afford to fully open its doors to Europe, not when local industries were still fragile, not when African manufacturers were still growing, not when millions of jobs depended on protecting domestic markets. And yet, under pressure, political, economic, and sometimes even diplomatic, many African countries eventually signed. It wasn't partnership, it wasn't equality, it was survival. In addition, African countries were also reluctant to sign the EPA because it would require them to reduce tariffs on imports, which were a source of government revenue. So, cutting tariffs meant reducing government revenue, which Africa needs to invest in areas including agriculture, health, and education. But did Europe care about their concerns? No. When African leaders brought their concerns to the table during a trade meeting with the European Union and seemed reluctant to sign the deal, guess what the EU did? To speed up the process so that African countries could quickly sign the agreement, the European Union threatened to not only withdraw foreign aid, which most African countries depended on as a source of revenue, but also end access to the European market for existing export products from reluctant states. In simple terms, the EU threatened to close its market to African exports. Imagine that. And yet, these are the same institutions that proudly call themselves value-driven, champions of peace, guardians of democracy, protectors of human rights. But in reality, they act like bullies, willing to threaten, pressure, and punish any nation that refuses to serve their interests, even if it destroys that country's economy, even if it keeps millions of people trapped in poverty. Faced with the EU's threats, many African governments had no choice but to sign. They weren't convinced, they were cornered, and the results were predictable. Local industries across Africa struggled to survive against Europe's well-funded, high-quality imports. Factories shut down, jobs disappeared. Governments lost revenue they desperately needed. Africa became more dependent on Western aid than ever before, and that was the point. Because the more dependent Africa is on aid, the more control the West has. Aid becomes a weapon, a silent tool used to force African leaders to obey, to fall in line, to put Western priorities above African interests. And we've seen this strategy play out again and again, decade after decade, crisis after crisis. But today, that old system is cracking. Trade isn't the only place where the inequality shows. Defense is another battlefield, one where the West controlled everything. For decades, France dictated what weapons countries in Francophone Africa could buy. and who they were allowed to buy them from. If Burkina Faso wanted advanced equipment or even nuclear technology from Russia, France would simply say no, and Burkina Faso had no choice but to obey. That was the relationship. Africa asks, the West decides. But the moment an African leader refuses to play along, the punishment begins. First, the leader is branded a dictator. Then comes the human rights narrative. After that, the sanctions start, wave after wave, crippling the economy until the country is barely standing, and the media, it transforms overnight. Nothing positive is allowed to be said about that country again. The leader becomes a villain, the nation becomes unstable, and the West presents itself as the savior. We've seen this script before. It happened to Libya and Muammar Gaddafi. It's happening to Eritrea and President Isaias Afwerki. It's happening to Zimbabwe, still buried under EU sanctions for more than 20 years. And now, the same strategy is being used against Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, countries that dared to step outside Western control. This is not partnership, this is punishment. And Africa has finally begun to recognize the pattern. But history teaches us something important. The oppressed never stay oppressed forever. There always comes a moment, a breaking point, when people rise, when nations awaken, when the chains begin to fall away, and that moment is happening across Africa right now. It may not always appear dramatic, it may not always make the headlines, but beneath the surface, the continent is transforming quietly, steadily, irreversibly, and the West knows it. That's why they're scared. African leaders have finally realized something the West hoped they would never understand. The West no longer has absolute power over them. Africa can survive and thrive without Western influence. This shift didn't happen randomly. It came from three major forces reshaping the world. The first, and the most powerful, is the rise of new global players. For decades, the West dominated global politics, global trade, and global security. They were the only players in the game. Not anymore. Today, China, Russia, India, Turkey, and Iran have stepped onto the field. They offer Africa alternatives, new partners, new markets, new alliances, and for the first time in modern history, the West is facing real competition. China and Russia in particular are seen as direct threats to Western global dominance, so the West has responded the only way it knows how: sanctions, pressure campaigns, hostile diplomacy, and attempts to limit their influence wherever possible. But despite all that, these countries continue to grow, and Africa has noticed. But these rising nations didn't just show up. They learned how to beat the West at its own game. Despite sanctions, despite political pressure, despite attempts to isolate them, countries like China and Russia pushed forward. And today, they have become exactly what the West feared: serious global competitors. Their voices grow louder on the world stage. Their influence reaches farther, and nowhere is this more visible than in Africa. In just 2 decades, China has transformed the continent's economic landscape. It is now Africa's largest trading partner, a position Europe once held without challenge. Africa-China trade has been growing at nearly 20% every year since 2000, hitting $188 billion by 2015. More than 3 times India's trade with Africa, and far above the European pace and Russia. It's not standing still. Moscow has steadily expanded its trade networks, military partnerships, and diplomatic ties across the continent, step by step, deal by deal, handshake by handshake, and then something even bigger happened. These nations, China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, began forming an alliance. An economic powerhouse, a bloc that could one day challenge the world's most dominant financial structures. The result was BRICS. What started as a trade concept has evolved into one of the most influential economic organizations on the planet, a group powerful enough to threaten Western institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which have shaped the developing world for decades. BRICS gives African countries something they never had before: options, alternatives, a way out, and that is why the West is worried. Countries like China, Russia, India, Turkey, and Iran also want partnerships in Africa. But here's the key difference. They are not trying to control African politics. They are not trying to dictate economic policy. They are not trying to dominate African militaries. Their relationships with Africa are built on mutual benefit, where both sides gain and both sides negotiate as equals. No bullying, no threats, no hidden conditions. And after decades of Western interference, Africa can clearly see the contrast. The West tried to isolate the continent, tried to keep Africa all to itself, but that monopoly is over. Today, Africa understands its value. It knows its power. It knows it has options. And no nation can bully a continent that finally knows its worth. But there's a second force driving Africa's transformation, one even more powerful than global geopolitics: the awakening of Africa's youth. Across the continent, a new generation has risen, a generation that refuses to repeat the mistakes of the past, a generation unwilling to bow to Western dominance. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and Julius Malema have become symbols of this new wave. Firebrand voices calling out neo-colonialism, resisting foreign influence, and demanding true sovereignty. You can see the shift everywhere. Growing anti-French sentiment across Francophone Africa. French troops being expelled from countries they once controlled. Public backlash against the International Criminal Court. A louder, bolder rejection of Western interference. This is not the Africa of the 1960s. This is not the Africa of the 1990s. This is a continent experiencing a mass awakening, socially, politically, psychologically, and once a people become aware, no power on earth can make them unsee the truth. Africa has reached that point, and nothing can kill this new consciousness.